Hi guys, my name is Carlos Pan and I'm going to be presenting on OFO, Lime, and the implications of the bike sharing boom. Okay, so first image I want to show is this bike graveyard, which has become unfortunately very commonplace in major Chinese cities like Shanghai and Beijing. And these images came out in around 2017 and sort of highlighted a very wasteful um, a travesty, really, of resources and capital that had come to the fore after OFO and Mobike went head to head in competition. So, as you can see, there's thousands upon thousands of bikes. And when I was looking at this case, I wanted to find out, who the main players were. As you can see in this image, there's thousands of yellow bikes, and the yellow bikes are characteristic of this company, OFO. So, what went wrong with OFO, and why exactly are so many of those bikes that are thrown away OFOs? Um, so OFO is a really interesting company. They have something called unicorn status, which is when a startup reaches more than $1 billion in valuation. And they did that actually only a few years after they were founded by college students at one of China's most prestigious institutions. By 2017, they had gathered investment from tech giants like Alibaba, sort of the Chinese equivalent of an Amazon, that had put in more than $700 million to fund OFO. And they had really accomplished something remarkable for a startup by acquiring a user base of 200 million people, as well as expanding internationally to 21 different countries. Eventually, them and their main competitor, Mobike, sort of reached the fore of the market by capturing 90% of bike sharing users within China. The market was very saturated by smaller firms, but they started pricing these smaller firms out with the capital they had acquired from funding. So OFO eventually reaches a crisis when they're still competing with Mobike. They lowered the prices such that their operational costs were not covered, and they were still spending a lot of their cash on capital to expand their operations. This includes internationally, of course. So Mobike, the competitor, continues to operate at the loss, and if OFO raises their prices, they lose their consumer base. So they were put in a position where they couldn't do that, but they didn't have the cash reserves to continue operating at this loss, which is when the crisis at OFO really hits. So this image on the right here is actually a report from a San Francisco news station showing all these OFO bikes that they had, spent money on. This is from an international market being recycled after they had to cancel operations in their international markets. So this was obviously a gradual cancellation. They sort of started regressing from their international markets back towards priority cities, which of course were in China. So after analyzing the OFO case, I wanted to look at Lime, which is a company I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Lime Scooters just started operating in Brookline, and they're looking to expand into Boston. You might see these bicycles around. They, like OFO, do have a standalone dockless bike. Just like OFO, they are a unicorn startup. They reached a valuation of $2.4 billion recently, and they also had a very aggressive market penetration technique, one that they actually took a page from Uber's book. When Uber first started out, they just went into cities and started operating. They didn't talk to the local government or seek permissions into operating. But the difference between Lime and Uber, of course, is that Lime comes with capital. So Lime was dropping off these scooters and these bikes, and the cities were just confiscating them, and they were losing the capital on these. So obviously, with Uber, you can't confiscate people's personal cars. So Lime sort of changed their tune when they ran into a lot of problems with different cities, and they received a lot of cease and desist letters, and they've taken a significantly more collaborative approach. They've also slowed down in their expansion. So who's to say how they would have proceeded if they hadn't been met with strict regulation, but there's a good chance that they would have kept pouring out capital into different places like they had been initially. So I wanted to ask, these are such comparable companies. Obviously, the United States and the Chinese market are very different, but I wanted to ask, how will Lime avoid the fate of OFO? So I drew out some key differences between the companies, and the first being that Lime is a significantly more diversified company. They have Lime bike, which is just a regular bike. They have electric assisted bikes. They have scooters, and they have a lot of collaborative projects with cities, with universities even. Uh, so they're significantly more diversified. Regulation differences also. While in many cases regulation is thought to hinder business activities, it really does protect them from themselves in this case. So, we saw earlier with the bike graveyards, OFO was pouring money into capital, and eventually, they priced themselves out. They had to draw back and regress. And Lime really hasn't done that. They haven't been as wasteful with their capital because they've come to see that the government will just confiscate those bikes. The government in China started confiscating bikes only when they actually clogged up the sidewalks, when there were so many bikes and not enough places to leave the bikes that they would just pile up on the sidewalk and then be confiscated. So again, Lime is very collaborative in their approach to cities now, and they have formed partnerships with universities and certain areas of cities, and they've curated the cities in which they operate with more carefully than OFO did. OFO sort of just stormed in wherever they could, and I don't think they did a very good job of determining whether or not a city was right for the product. Certain cities are not meant to have bike sharing services because, or at least dockless bike sharing services, because they won't be as useful. Many sections of cities will. For example, in Los Angeles, if you're in certain areas of Los Angeles could benefit from a bike sharing concept, but the entire city as a whole, it couldn't because it is too large of a city, too spread out, and it is extremely dependent on cars. Pedestrian cities are more likely to benefit from bike sharing services. So Lime has done a good job of curating the cities in which they operate. So what are the main takeaways from this comparison and this case? I think that there's value for startups building a company in the long run. A lot of times with a lot of recent startups, the goal is to gather as many users as possible. I think there's a key example made in terms of international expansion. OFO was very ambitious in their international expansion, when in China, in their main market, they had yet to cover their own operational costs. They did not generate enough revenue to cover their own operations within China. So, going international when they did seemed like they jumped the gun a little bit. Next takeaway is that city altering technologies should really work with local governments, because the local governments have shown time and time again that they will step in. And we've seen that with Lime, with the confiscation of scooters. We've seen that with Uber, and a lot of places. For example, airports, there have been regulations made, like added to Uber. And we've seen it with Airbnb, with a lot of Airbnb listings being deemed illegal and canceled. So whenever a technology or an app that's going to fundamentally change how industries within a city operate, they should seek to work with the local governments. And the last takeaway is that the regulation that we see in the United States really benefits us, the consumers, and the businesses, because the really relaxed laissez-faire regulation we saw in China cost so much capital. It cost investors a lot of money, and it had environmental issues that were really unforeseen, because ideally a bike sharing service should be better on the environment. It should mean less fossil fuels being burnt, and it should lessen the load on public transportation. So regulation can be beneficial, and companies should seek to work within it. So thanks for watching. This is the end. Thank you to Allison for your help and your feedback. And thanks to all the peer reviewers for taking the time and giving me some constructive feedback. Thanks a lot.